Running? All right. So we are on chapter 2, Mishnah 6. And we are continuing with the do's and don't interaction with products and items that belong to non-Jews. And in this particular case, we're going to be dealing with things that are more edible, with more food-type products. One of the things that we should immediately note from this is that there were times and things that Jews could eat that were made by non-Jews and even idolaters. So that's why the rabbis have to spell out the things that we're not allowed to eat, or the things that we're not allowed to eat but can benefit from, and all of those variations. So there wasn't that we just said, stay away. Someone coming? It wasn't just that we said, stay away from them and never eat anything. Was there someone at the door? We need to draw straws or take turns. We are looking at limits for the things that we can and can't. And I'll just do a little dance while we wait for the door to...
I'm looking at the
list
that are forbidden.
Mm-hmm.
Now I understand why you have to look for kosher on vinegar.
Right, we're gonna come back to that. Yeah. And we're also going to look at some of the things that were prohibited and then permitted. Yeah, which is a back and forth. Someone coming?
Yes.
Oh, okay. You weren't just opening the door for Eliyahu, right? All right. So
maybe it was part of the basic food that the nutrition that every person needs to have. So maybe the rabbi, because I'm reading a little here,
right.
Rabbi tried to cover that. You know what? At least you are not starving. You have the basic one for survival.
Partly, and partly it was just eating food that was clearly kosher from non-Jewish sources was fine. Eating food that was clearly not kosher or likely involved in idolatry was not fine. The question is always, where's the line? Where is food that might be kosher, but might not be kosher? And how do we know when we don't, or when we can and can't? And also that whole idolatrous side coming into it. So that's what Mishnah 6 is going to take us through. I need a reader. They're all looking at you. All right, yeah.
The following articles of non-Jews are prohibited, but the prohibition does not extend to deriving benefit from them.
Right, so this means you can get benefit from them, but you are not allowed to eat them. So this is a lesser level of prohibition.
Okay. Number 1, milk, which a non-Jew milk without an Israelite watching.
All right, we're going to try and talk about these as we go through, because otherwise it just gets crazy. What is the potential problem of milk? That if you weren't watching them milk?
You mix it.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a case where, if you can grab one of the packets as you come in, this is a case where you might, the idolatrous milkman might be mixing the kosher milk with a non-kosher variety. So if someone is milking their cow and then they also get a little donkey milk and they mix it in, then how would you know? And this presumably in the ancient world would have been done because you are inflating the volume with a cheaper quality of milk. And that doesn't work for us, right? Because donkey milk isn't kosher. I understand there are some places in the world where they still do donkey milk. I remember seeing a travel show, Bizarre Food, where there was a guy who had they were literally walking the donkey along, and if you wanted donkey milk, they would milk the donkey into a cup, and you could drink it right there on the spot. Yeah.
So we can sell the milk from a
non-Jew who we didn't watch milking. We can sell their milk to someone else, not to a Jewish person. We can buy and trade. We could use their milk as a whitewash.
But we cannot consume it. We cannot use for business.
Right. However, you may now know that most of us, I'm willing to bet, when you buy milk, you're not going to the farm and watching the non-Jew milk the cow. Right? Anybody here ever actually gone to the farm to get their milk? No, of course not. What's that? You have done that, yes. But do you do that today? No. And that is because way back in the beginning of the 20th century, Rav Moshe Feinstein for America said we can rely on the FDA and we can rely on government inspectors to ensure that the milk that we have is the milk that it says on the label. So when it says cow milk, we can trust that it's cow milk even though we weren't there watching it. That's why technically you do not need a hechsher for milk in the United States. Right? If you are in some other country where they don't have supervision and it just says cow milk, and you believe that there's a chance that someone could easily put other types of milk in and might have a profit motive to do so, then you have to be careful and probably want to look for a hechshered milk. But
we don't drink goat milk?
Oh, goat milk is kosher. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Now, do I personally drink goat milk? Not so much, but it is kosher to drink.
What milk is not kosher?
Well, in the United States, there are very, very few milks that get made that aren't kosher. Donkey milk, horse milk would be an example. Dog milk would be an example.
Okay, that kind of milk. Okay.
Well, any other mammal except for cloven hoof and chewed skag. Yeah. Let's go to the Middle East, right? Camel milk would have been another option. I don't know if camel. No, absolutely. Yeah, camel is one of those very famous not kosher because it looks like it's chewing its cud, but it doesn't have the cloven hoof. So it's like half appearing kosher, and it is off the list. All right, so that covers milk. Two,
the bread and oil. Rabbi and his code permitted the oil.
All right, so this is a very interesting one because is this Penelope telling me it's not working? Someone open the door. That's Penelope. Oh, would you mind? Thank you. That's Penelope picking up Nathaniel. Usually we have one of the gift shop people are still there, and
yeah, I saw them just leave.
Permit the oil means to eat the oil.
Yes.
To eat.
Yes.
When you say permit means
no problem
to consume.
to consume. All right, so well, we'll just wait for her to come back because this is a little complicated, and you're probably going to think it also controversial.
So can I buy it? I can buy the bread at Publix, can I?
Yes, you can.
Okay.
Yes, you can. So what we're going to see is this prohibition is one, you already see half of it having been walked back. And we're going to talk about why it was walked back and why Publix is not even an issue in the original decree. Right? So the original decree about prohibiting the bread and the oil had nothing to do with kashrut. It had nothing to do with idolatry. It had to do with socializing with idol worshipers. Right? So your idol worshiping neighbor invites you over to their house and they offer you bread. And the bread is just made from wheat and water. I mean, and maybe a little bit of salt. There's nothing in there that would be non-kosher. In the ancient world, the rabbi said, don't eat it. Because if you eat it, you're going to get friendly with them. You're going to socialize with them. And if you socialize with them, then one thing leads to another, and the next thing you know, you're bowing down to an idol. That this was a prohibition to keep a barrier between the Jews and the idol worshipers socially. And even if you knew that it was kosher, even if you knew that it hadn't been used for idolatry, the rabbis were saying you shouldn't eat it. But there's a problem. First of all, the problem is sometimes I need bread from non-Jewish sources, and the Talmud already discussed. What's that?
When a hurricane comes.
Like when a hurricane comes. And so the Talmud already discusses a caveat to this, which is bread that comes from a baker is permitted, right? Because you're not socializing with the baker, you're just buying their bread, right? So therefore, buying a loaf of bread off the rack at Publix is not an issue here. But there was also the issue that edicts that the rabbis made that the community could not uphold, that they were incapable of actually maintaining this level of stringency that the rabbis put in place, and there was no other reason underneath it of not kosher or idol worshiping or something, they can fall. Those edicts can be walked back, which is what you see here with Rabbi, right? The prohibition on having the oil from non-Jewish sources. Well, we need oil. I mean, olive oil was the most important basic ingredient in life apart from flour in the ancient and classical world. Prohibiting the sources that weren't Jewish was going to cripple everyone's life. And so eventually, because people never fully accepted the edict, Rabbi was able to permit what had been prohibited. It was almost like it never caught on that we're not going to do this. And so eventually they took it out. This is something that becomes a much bigger issue in the modern world, because in the ancient world, you had diverse communities, something I talked about in the last conversion class on last Thursday night. Check my YouTube. And because you had yes, of course. I mean, I've got like 15 people in the room, but it's also on YouTube in case someone misses a class or people who just can't come.
I thought it was like 17.
Yeah, no, that's right. We had more. We had like 15 the first week, and we had more last time. So when you have a diverse community, you end up with a very, what's the statistical term? A representative sample, right? You have a very good representative sample, and therefore, when you make a particular proclamation or a rule, not an interpretation of law, but a new rule because your community needs it. You know, from now on, everyone has to bring $1, you know, for X reason. That's not in Torah, that's a decision of the community. If you have a diverse community and the community lives up to it, then that becomes the new custom, the new practice of the community, and that then becomes something that we don't change without extremely good reasons. But if you have a diverse community and you make something into practice and the community can't uphold to it, they can't live up to it. So from now on, everybody has to bring $1,000 every time you come to Mishnah class, right? I think we'd have a problem with our community living up to that. You're all nodding, which means we're not going to happen. So that means that edict, as much as the rabbi or rabbis who are giving it want it to stick, won't stick. And when it doesn't stick, that means it's no longer the edict. And when that happens in a diverse community, you can usually see a natural progression of which things are willing to be assumed by the community, which things are not, when you're going above and beyond. If you have a homogeneous community, a monolithic community, communities where you don't have that diversity of opinions and of practice and of belief, it's much easier to either permit or prohibit things that the entirety of the Jewish people would never stand for. So you can have some communities that will prohibit styles of eyeglasses because they're too, pagan. This is a modern thing. Yes, there are some communities that will not allow you to wear certain types of glasses because it's too much like what the non-Jews wear. And then you have other communities that will permit all sorts of things that really should not be permitted, in this rabbi's opinion, because in their community, everyone thinks it's a fine idea. And so that's what happens when you get too homogenous of a community. It allows you to veer one direction or another. It's that diversity of opinion, that representative sample is very important. Question?
So that's a problem when you have a lot of uniformity. For example, the modern Orthodox, that's why they move too much to the right, because they are, everyone thinks the same way.
Right, but it's a self-selecting process. It's not that they all think the same way. It's the people who think the same way stay together, and the people who disagree leave. And that means you're left with a homogeneous population. So it's not that everybody is being brainwashed. God forbid, people are choosing to be in these different communities, but they're also choosing to leave communities that are different than themselves. And that means you end up with these more and more purebred communities, which is not healthy. It's not healthy in any kind of population. That's one reason why I like the fact that the conservative movement is a big tent population where we can get lots of opinions, some of which we agree with, some of which we don't, some of which are too extreme, some of which are too lenient, and we put it in the pot, we mix it up, using the cooking metaphor, and we end up with something that is much healthier for the final thing. We also end up with something that's usually less satisfying to everybody because nobody gets exactly what they want. And the process makes a horrible mess, absolutely, right? Look at the kitchen after a good cooking, right? The kitchen is very messy, and at least my kitchen is when I'm cooking. Penelope's more tidier than me, but that's what you end up with. And that is what Judaism has as a natural process had for most of our history. And here you can actually see a little bit of that taste of the rabbis tried something and it didn't quite work out. And so they backed off on it. But nowadays you have people who are putting back in some of these prohibitions. So you have people nowadays talking about pat akum, that you shouldn't eat the bread of idolaters, and you have people talking about, the shemen, the oil ban again. And of course, you have the Chalav Yisrael movement of only eat milk that's, from a Jewish source, Jewish cows, not, Jewish source. Those are resurgent because the communities that are chasing them are more monolithic, they're more homogenous, and they're
here in the U.S. In Israel?
Both.
Both.
Right. In particular Orthodox communities in any country, you're having the move in these directions because they can, because the people who disagree leave, and so you're left with only people who agree. So yeah, society, life, Judaism works best when we all say there's no exit, right? We're all in this together, and we need to figure this out together. And that is what will make us come to better answers rather than just everybody who disagrees leave.
It brings up balance as well, because then everybody has to get along with everybody, and we have to disagree and agree to disagree.
Exactly.
That's what me and Natan were talking about.
Yes.
That, about agreeing to disagree and
it's
move on. But
much healthier. Exactly.
Exactly. It is so well balanced.
Yes.
And that's why, for example, I always prefer to have a committee that they have very diverse opinion.
Exactly.
Or board, because
Right.
it's more difficult the conversation, the decision, but I think it's more rich.
Yes,
Exactly.
I agree.
And that's the great thing. Again, in the Mishnah, we don't see as many examples of it because that wasn't its purpose. But in the Talmud, you see the range of opinion and the fighting over what does this mean, what does that mean, how far do we go, how far do we not go. That's the lovely part about the Talmud, is you can see all of that meaty, grindy, cooking goodness of how we come to our decisions and how everybody's in the kitchen. And despite what they say, the more chefs in the kitchen, the better in Judaism. We want more people cooking. All right, so that's part 2. Part 3, Yarach.
Stewed and pickled things into which they are accustomed to put wine or vinegar.
All right, so this is the obvious reason that if they are putting wine or vinegar, which is made from wine, right? That's the primary form of vinegar in the classical world. Then we're worried about the wine, and therefore things that are pickled with that wine would also be a problem. Right, so this is why pickled herring, even though the herring itself is perfectly fine kosher fish, you can even see the scales on it, you still have to make sure that it's not being made with wine. That would be inappropriate. For example, why we're going to go on to part 4.
4. Pickled herring, which has been minced.
Right, so minced, like, ground up into tiny little pieces. The problem with this,
I don't know what it is.
Exactly, it's kind of like the milk, right? If someone was to grind up a whole bunch of fish, and some of the fish were kosher and some of the fish weren't kosher, could you tell the difference? No. Again, in the modern world where we have food and drug laws that have inspectors and severe repercussions for people that are lying, we can generally, if there's no other reason to be suspicious, rely on accurate labeling. But you still have to make sure, and thankfully in the modern world we have a wonderful system of hashgacha that there are hechshers on almost anything that you'd want to eat and that you are allowed to eat. So it shouldn't be too hard to find hechshers for what you need.
And there's not a law that says that if you don't know to welcome the food, that someone give you the food, and you don't know really exactly, it's fine if you eat because it's not your fault.
Kind of and kind of not. I know, yes and no. It's the world's greatest answer. So if someone gives you food and the source is one that you would generally rely on, and it's in a community that you would on average rely on, then yes, you can go ahead and eat it. On the other hand, if you are in the middle of Rome in the 1st century BCE, and someone hands you something that you don't know them, and they don't know kashrut and what you care about, then you would have to be suspicious of what it is. Going after the majority is a general rule. There's actually a very interesting section in the Talmud when they're talking about kosher meat, that if you're walking along the road and there's a piece of kosher meat there's a piece of meat, and yes, people would still want to eat it, right? There's a piece of meat on the road, and you have to decide, am I allowed to eat this or not? If the majority of the people in that part of the town keep kosher, then you assume that it's kosher meat that happened to fall. And if the majority of the people in that part of the town are non-Jews who don't keep kosher, then you assume it's not kosher and you just leave it there. So there are some ways that when in doubt, you get permission, and when in doubt, you don't. And it depends on those other factors. All right. Part 5.
Brine in which there is no kilbit fish floating.
Of course,
What
because
is kilbit fish?
we don't know. Right. So in the ancient world, what this meant was that you would always have kilbit fish with kosher fish. That if you were, or rather the other way around, if you were going to have kosher fish in like a bucket or a barrel, there would always be kilbit fish in there too. If the kilbit fish weren't there, then you didn't have any guarantee that those other fish were kosher. So it was kind of like an indicator of the kashrut of the fish. We don't really need to worry about it now because most of us are not buying barrels of fish. But that was just a marker that the standard practice was if it's kosher fish, it also has this kilbit bits in it, and if it's not kosher, it doesn't. So without the kilbit, I can't trust it. Make sense? It was a lot more complicated before things had OU stamped on them, where you actually had to make your own decisions because you would go down to the marketplace and there'd be a fisherman selling stuff, and you had to be able to know, am I allowed to eat this? Am I not allowed to eat this? And it's fine to say you always get fresh, but you don't always get fresh. Sometimes you have pickled, salted, and other types of preservatives. It wasn't, going to the supermarket with a nice whole fish laid out on the ice in the cooler section. You had to try and figure out, what am I buying, in order to make sure you were doing all right. All right, 6.
Hilak.
Okay, so apparently this was another type of fish that didn't have scales when it was little, but did get scales when it's older.
It's not like a swordfish.
Like swordfish, exactly. Although from what I understand, it's the opposite with swordfish, right? They have scales as babies and then they lose them.
So if you eat, you need to eat it as...
No, you can always eat it. Any fish that has scales at any point during its life cycle is kosher during any point during its life cycle. But how do you know what you have is one of those fish? And that was the issue here. That because the hilak did not look kosher when you bought it, even though it was kosher technically, you had to be suspicious when you were buying it from a non-Jewish source. So it was probably okay, but not 100% enough to go ahead and eat it. But if you were going to catch it yourself, it would have been fine. So just like with swordfish, that, the big controversy with swordfish happened because when people first caught swordfish, the full big swordfish, they said, well, there's no scales, it can't be kosher. And then as they investigated the biology of it, they found out it used to have scales when it was an infant, and then the scales go away when it grows up. And unfortunately, by that point, the tradition had already become, don't eat swordfish. So even with new information, most rabbis were not willing to re-examine swordfish. But yes, swordfish is technically kosher. I'm perfectly fine eating swordfish.
I was offered swordfish.
What's that?
I was offered swordfish yesterday. I wouldn't eat it. I said it's not kosher.
It is technically kosher.
I just
Now you know. And knowing is half the board.
Swordfish with a mashed potato.
Yeah. I mean, it is a beautiful fish. It's been a long time since I've had it, but it is a very, very nice tasting fish. And it is a kosher fish. But many people who keep kosher won't eat it.
I thought, from what I've learned, is that a kosher fish has to have scales and fins.
Yes?
They have to have both. They can't have one or the other.
Correct. Swordfish do have both during its young part of its adolescence. And that is enough, the Talmud says, for a fish to be considered kosher. It doesn't have to have them all the time.
Because I'm not good with fish. I don't know, but I thought catfish had scales.
Nope, catfish are smooth all their life. No scales. Just like shark. I mean, different texture, but like shark as well don't have real scales. Or a whale doesn't have real scales. Yeah, so catfish is not kosher.
And why is the scale so important?
You're going to have to ask the creator about that. Right, that is to say, in the Torah, it says these are the signs that we need. Just like, why is the cloven hoof important? Why is chewing the cud important for a land animal? Fins and scales were considered to be the marks of true sea animals. They are the the archetype, the paradigm of what it means to be a sea animal. And things that didn't have one or the other, or both, were considered to be lesser examples of what the sea had to offer. And so we didn't eat from them.
It comes from, like we just said, shark is a predator. And you know what he eats is not good for you.
But so is a barracuda. But a barracuda is kosher.
But
yeah.
Barracuda is good.
Yeah. I don't know that people eat. I don't know that people eat barracuda a lot. I mean, I just know that that is a predator fish, but it is kosher. Yes. So I've never seen barracuda on a menu.
That would have been interesting.
But you know, I've never seen giraffe on a menu. But giraffe is also kosher.
You eat giraffe?
Not me personally, because I don't live in Africa. But giraffe is kosher.
Expensive.
I would imagine so. And then you still have to have the right kosher butcher and all of the other issues. But the basic animal giraffe is kosher.
What about zebra?
No, because they have regular like horse hooves.
Horse.
Yeah, and I don't think they chew their cud either. Okay, there's actually, again, I've mentioned him on many of my YouTubes. So for people who are watching at home, this is probably familiar. Rabbi Natan Slifkin, I believe is his name. He is called the Zoo Rabbi. RationalistJudaism.com. He puts together every year, every 2 years, a feast of exotic kosher food, including things like giraffe, that he goes and has this the special process to get different types of animals and different things that are kosher, but not the normal kosher food, to try and show people the range of kosher that is out there. His whole specialty is animals in Jewish literature. So what better way than to eat them? All right. Number 7.
Pieces of asa fotida.
Okay. Some kind of nasty plant that was a very sharp flavor and a very kind of like spicy, nasty flavor. For the plant, we're going to get to the leaves in the next Mishnah. But for the plant itself, there was a concern that when it was being cut, that because of its nature, the knife would cross-contaminate between it and other things. So therefore, the pieces of it, even though the plant itself is kosher, you're not allowed to eat. Because if it's an idolater cutting it, then you don't know where their knife has been. And in general terms, plants, we don't concern ourselves with where the knife has been. But when it comes to plants that are especially acidic and spicy, that becomes a bigger issue. That's like, you know, the difference between cutting an onion with a knife and cutting a cucumber with a knife, as far as the kashrut of the knife goes. But that's a whole nother story for studying kashrut in more detail. And part 8.
And sal conditu.
Right, which we all know, which was apparently, I know, no one knows this. These are all examples of foods that might be thought to be kosher, but there's something about them that makes it problematic. And we're still allowed to eat it, or not, sorry, we're not allowed to eat it, but we're still allowed to benefit from it. This in particular was apparently a type of salt mixture that was mixed with oils and fats, usually from non-kosher animals.
To give it more
flavor. Exactly, exactly. So think like, you know, if you take salt and were to mix it together with like animal lard and make a lovely salty, fatty, it's like, you know, the ultimate dream, right? We love salt, we love fat, and they would mix these together and then you'd use it like a condiment. You'd use it with other food. Well, the salt part, no problem. It's the lard part that becomes a bit of an issue. And then go ahead and finish it off.
Behold, these are prohibited, but the prohibition does not extend to deriving benefit.
All right, just to make sure that we got the full picture. All right, 2.7. And now we're going to get things that you can eat that you might have thought you couldn't eat. All right, so now that you're hungry, let's see what we can actually eat.
Okay, Mishnah 7. The following are permitted to be eaten by an Israelite.
Right.
1. Milk, which a non-Jew milk with the Jew watching.
Right, so if there is supervision, then of course, it's right, a cow, we're done. You know, cow milk, I get to eat it, I've seen it, I know you haven't mixed it, we're fine. And again, this is where the modern supervision comes in, that is, well, but in the modern supervision, we will trust even a non-Jewish supervisor if we know that there are proper stringencies and repercussions for cheating and deception, which there wasn't in the ancient world. That's a very modern thing. It's one of those regulations that really helps is knowing that if people put contaminants into the food, they're going to be in bigger trouble than just me being angry at them. All right, part two.
Part two, honey.
All right, so even though you could add something to honey, generally speaking, people don't add things to honey, and even when things are added to honey, you can usually see them in the honey. Therefore, it's permitted.
3, grape clusters. Even though these secrete moistures, the law which renders food susceptible to defilement
Tuma.
by a liquid does not apply to them.
All right, so we have two.
Also the honey is very resistant because it has so high sugar, quantity of sugar that is very resistant to anything with this. That's why usually they don't have due date.
Right. Well, honey, not just does it not have a due date, honey will never spoil.
Yeah.
Ever.
Exactly.
They have found honey. It'll crystallize, it'll solidify, but it never rots and it never goes bad. They have found honey from the pyramids, like in Egypt, in tombs, that is still fine. I mean,
You can eat it?
you could. You have to soften it up again, but it wouldn't injure you to eat it. Right? It is still edible because it's just this like perfect sugar food that what can go wrong?
So that's why maybe it's part that you can take it for sure that it's fine.
That this is fine, exactly. Now the grape clusters, there's two issues happening here. One is we talked about before, the grape skins, the grape seeds, and of course wine. Those are off limits because all of those could be used within the idolatrous practice, and that would be a problem. Grape clusters, meaning whole bunches of whole bunches of grapes. End of the day, sometimes English escapes me. And those would be okay because they have not been processed yet. They have not been turned into anything that might have been used for a libation or idol worship. And therefore, that's fine. And then it adds in this extra point that even if you're worried that some of them are leaking grape juice is not a concern when it comes to tum'ah. There are certain types of liquids that when they come into contact with food, that food now becomes able to be rendered ritually impure. But grape juice is not one of them, so therefore we don't have to worry about sticky clusters of grapes having been made ritually impure. So it's really kind of an aside about grape clusters in general, but the Mishnah puts it here because we're talking about them.
So all these protections are against idolaters. What about against the non-Jews? Do we have the same limitation with all the food?
Depends who you ask. Depends who you ask. So this is something, for example, that came up very strongly in the 80s and 90s with the issue of yain, of wine, because that nothing is more symbolic in the ancient world of idolatry than the way they use their wine for their idol worship. But in the modern world, nothing is less used for worship than wine. If you go to Napa Valley and ask them about their wine, there are no idols anywhere in the winery, and they're not making offerings to any gods with their wine. And I refer you to the very lengthy, detailed, and insightful tshuva written by Rabbi Elliot Dorff, who I had the honor of studying with, where he went through and investigated exactly this, and it was his opinion that in cities and countries where there is supervision of the wine production, it's not just happening in someone's backyard, and where there is no reason to assume idolatrous influence, that wine made by Jews or by faceless corporations that meet those criteria should be acceptable to Jews. We still prefer wine that we know is kosher and that has a kosher seal for ritual purposes, because that's important as reinforcing our own sources of these things. But if you wanted to have a glass of Napa Chardonnay that was not from a hechshered winery, Rabbi Dorff's tshuva explains very well why that is very reasonable. RabbinicalAssembly.org, if you don't know, it's the Rabbinical Assembly website. Go into the Jewish Law tab. Many of the tshuvot regarding these issues and many other issues are found there. That will go into much more detail than we have for tonight.
So with the non-Jews, it's more flexible.
Yes, absolutely. Right. With the non-Jews, you really just have to investigate, is it not kosher, as opposed to, is there a suspicion of idolatry? And also the question of interaction is not as problematic, in terms of socializing with someone. 4.
Preserves into which they are not accustomed to put wine or vinegar.
Right. So if in this country they make pickles without vinegar or wine, then you can eat their pickles. Right. If it's just salted, like in salt water and brine, that's fine. Right. Or if there's some other preservative they use that is not a kosher problem and also not an idolatrous problem, that's fine. That it depends on what the local custom is. 5.
Pickled herring which has not been minced.
So you'll be able to see if it's one fish or if it's herring plus some other eel or some other thing. So that's a little bit clearer. Continuing.
6. Brine containing fish.
Right. So in this case, we're looking at if there's actually the fish in it that we can see clearly. Remember, we talked about this in the last one. Thank you. I always forget the name because it's not the thing. The kilbit. The kilbit. Then we have a sign that is going to be a kosher type of fish. 7.
A leaf of asa teda.
Right. So this is the leaf, not the actual plant. The leaf did not have the same astringency issues, the spiciness to it. Therefore, the leaves of the plant were fine because they wouldn't be cutting that with the knife. That would cause the cross-contamination. Enjoy your leaf. Onward.
Enrolled olive cakes.
Right, so apparently olive cakes, that is to say, olives themselves, be 2 hands. Right, what they would do would be press the olives into a lump. That would be a way of sort of selling them as a block of crushed olive mass. And not the way we buy our olives today, but nowadays we have cans and other ways to buy our olives. What's that?
Yes, it's not like that. It's not like
rolled up olive bits. Yes, yes, and that's a holdover. I mean, I'm saying in this country we don't normally buy those sorts of things. If you go to the supermarket and ask for an olive cake, what? But yes, in Israel and other Middle Eastern countries, people do still have olives like that.
Talking about this, I've been to Walmart and they have olives that there's nothing in there, very little moisture, and they will like in a
pressed
together.
All right,
in a plastic. Yeah,
I stand corrected. I didn't know they were making olives like that here.
And like you said, it's from the Middle East. I think from Turkey,
right,
or somewhere.
Well, now you know they've been making olives like that for a few thousand years, and I guess they still, but they're exporting them, which I didn't know. Right, so those there wasn't a concern that they had wine added to them or anything else, so that was considered permissible. Rabbi Yossi pushes back.
Rabbi Yossi say those olives having pits ready to drop out are prohibited.
All right, so he's worried that the pits being ready to come out means that the olives have been softened, and if they've been softened, something was added that made them go soft, and therefore you shouldn't. But the halakha does not go according to him. He loses this argument. Okay, and then everybody's favorite food,
locusts.
Locusts. Everybody loves bugs. Right, remember, there are species of locusts that are kosher.
Yeah.
Right. So most people do not eat them nowadays, but they were eaten in the ancient world, and they were an important source of protein. So
locusts which come out of a shopkeeper's basket are prohibited, but if from storage, they are permitted.
All right. So apparently, again, not being a big locust shopper, I have to go off what our tradition has told me about this issue, which is the locusts that were out for the shopkeeper's bins. Those locusts, he would have dribbled wine over in order to prepare them for sale. But the locusts that were back in storage, they hadn't had that treatment yet. So if you go to a shop, you can say, no, I want locusts, but not these. I want 5 pounds from the back.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. I want 5 pounds without wine, just straight locusts. And those would be permitted. All right. And then part A.
The same rule applies to teruma.
Which is to say that truma that has had truma locusts that might have had wine dripped on them could be a problem, and if it comes from storage, however, then there would not be an issue, right? There wouldn't be any truma wine that had been used with them inappropriately. Make sense?
Yes.
Okay, we still have 10 minutes, and I have photocopies for chapter 3, where we are going to change topics. I mean, we're still doing Avodah Zarah. We're still doing idolatry. But we're actually getting into some of the nuts and bolts of what does it mean to worship something that is an idol. Right? So far, the whole first 2 chapters have been how we interact with idol worshipers. Now we're going to talk about our own idolatry, of what does it mean for someone to become an idol worshiper. So, chapter 3, Mishnah 1. Yerach, you okay? Keep going?
All images are prohibited because they are worshipped once a year, according to the opinion of Rabbi Meir.
Go ahead and do part A.
But the sages say an image is not prohibited except one that has a staff or a bird or orb in its hand.
All right, so let's take those 2 parts.
That's
Yes.
not interesting because I make association with the Catholicism. They have a lot of this image that all this, that with bird, with fur, with stuff,
Yeah.
and everything.
So-
and we spoke before that the Catholicism doesn't apply as idolaters.
By most
Jews.
opinions, right?
Yes.
Now, so let's back up a little bit. So first of all, we're not talking about what idolatry means for others. We're talking about for Jews, right? What are you allowed to own? What are you allowed to have in your possession? What are you allowed to even benefit from, right? Because we're going to get to a little more complicated, but for example, if someone gives you a beautiful gold statue and says, this is my God, and I want you to have it, or they leave it on your doorstep, because you would just say, no, thank you. But let's imagine they leave it on the doorstep, and it says, this is a God, I think you should have it, you should bow down and worship it. You're not allowed to just sell it and keep the money, even if it's solid gold. Now, we're going to talk about some of the complicated issues of whether you can or can't. That's later. So if you're going to ask me about selling the gold, hold that until we get to that later.
It's only-
Benefit that selling the gold doesn't destroy
When I
you.
used to-
You gold. Yeah.
Yeah.
When I used to work for a client,
Mhm.
taking care of seniors, elderly, I had a lady who wanted to offer me some type of necklace
Mhm.
that had some type of blessing,
Right.
but it was from her religion, which had nothing to do with Judaism. It was,
A polite no thank you.
Yeah.
A polite no
But
thank you.
some get really offended.
Yes, but if the person is truly doing it as a gift to you, then they should respect your response, right? I mean, if someone wanted to give me
But I didn't take it.
Right.
I didn't accept it.
and if it's to being done out of the goodness of their heart, then they should respect your response to their offer. If it's being done just because they want to force you to have it, then it's not really a gift.
If you just say, oh, this is a good luck charm, or this is a good luck, whatever.
Right.
And
You simply say, oh, sorry, I don't do that. But I really appreciate you thinking of me, and all of that would be fine. All right, so let's look at these 2 contrasts here. Back in the Mishnah itself. All images are prohibited, says Rabbi Meir, because they are worshipped once a year. The general interpretation of this is that idolaters worship everything at least once a year.
That's
That-
minimum.
Right, a minimum, right? There's no such thing as an image they don't bow down to. And therefore, Rabbi Meir is saying all images for all Jews, even if you're not thinking you're going to bow down to it, are out, right? No art in your house. No paintings, no sculptures, nothing. Because some idol worshiper somewhere is worshiping it. And therefore, you're not allowed to have it. Now, Rabbi Meir loses this argument But the sages aren't ready to say, go ahead, have whatever you want in your house. They say, yes, you can have images, but you can't have images that have in them symbols of authority. Because if the image has a symbol of authority, that's what they mean by the orb or the scepter or the bird, then that means this image is being given status. This image is being given signs of power. And that is the gateway to idolatry. So that's the distinction that the rabbis are trying to say. So if you want a picture of the Mona Lisa, fine. But if the Mona Lisa has a world in her hand, then that is on the threshold of idolatry. And people worship images that look just like that. And if you look back through the mosaics of the ancient world, that was what they did, right? You had orbs, you had staves, and all sorts of other things, even birds, as symbols of their might, their grandeur, their authority. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel throws on.
Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, any image which has anything in its hands is prohibited.
So he wanted to be a little bit more careful than the sages by saying, you know, staff, orb, feathers, birds, those are problems. But you know, sometimes they stick other stuff in their hands too. And therefore, we shouldn't have images with anything in their hands. Remember, they're not talking about whether or not you're allowed to buy a painting of Zeus with a lightning bolt. If it says, this is Zeus and he is the god of gods, you're not allowed to own it, even if he doesn't have a lightning bolt in his hand. What they're talking about here are general images that could become objects of worship. And he's worried that if you stick anything in the image's hand, it's giving it too much sign of authority, power, or dominion over that era. So if you have, like, for example, a picture of a man holding grapes, that might eventually become worshipped as the god of grapes. If he's holding a shovel, that might become the god of farmers. If he's holding a rope, it's the god of sailors. And even if he wasn't that god at the beginning, people can begin worshiping it because of the association.
One time is a picture of Moses with
his staff. Absolutely. Yeah, or Aaron with the fire pan, or all sorts of, or David with the harp. The short answer, because we only have time for a short answer, is that Jewish art has had a long and well-debated history about whether or not you were supposed to make pictures like that. In the modern world, most authorities, even in Orthodoxy and all the way across the spectrum, say that pictures that are obviously designed not to be worshipped but are to represent our figures from our history are permitted. But there are some authorities that have said no. That absolutely any images like that are problematic. That Moses with a staff, you shouldn't make a picture of it. In fact, if you go back to the Middle Ages, when illuminated manuscripts were very popular, there's one very famous one of the Bird's Head Haggadah, where it's a Haggadah that is illustrated, and everyone has the head of a bird. It's like all these people look like parakeets. And the idea there was it's not a human, therefore it's not causing a problem. That was their compromise for that painting. And there's just a whole range of books that discuss art within Jewish law and within Jewish practice. And in general, we have now come to a point where art generally is approved by almost all communities, as long as certain guidelines are followed. Right? You don't want to make it look like we're worshiping Moses, but making a picture of Moses is usually fine. All right, do we have time for one more? Let me remind myself of part. Yeah. Yes, 3-2. It fits together very nicely.
3, 2, 1. One who finds fragments of images, behold, they are permitted.
All right, so you're walking down the road and you find a shattered marble statue, and there's a head, and there's a hand, and there's a hip, and there's an orb, and you think, boy, I could really use that marble. It's okay. Gather up those broken pieces, use them for whatever you like. However,
if one found the figure of a hand or the figure of a foot, behold, it is prohibited because such an object is worshipped.
the general consensus in the Gemara is that what we're talking about here is a statue or an idol of a hand, not a broken hand, not a broken foot, but an intact hand or foot that was set up as though it was meant to be worshipped. And that is prohibited. So even though it's only part of the image, because it was arranged in a way that might be worshipped, that becomes a problem, and we are not allowed to get any benefit or advantage from this. But the broken hand of a statue, that you can take. Good?
So, I guess this is a silly question and a statement, but like, if you go to Crane's Roost,
Right.
it has in the, near the water fountain in that little bit.
Right.
On top of the building, it has, I don't know what they are, but Greek goddess.
I didn't even notice.
Holding the earth.
Right.
Holding the earth together. I guess.
So that would probably be Atlas, right?
Yeah.
In Greek mythology, Atlas, who was a Titan, was said to carry the earth or the sky on his shoulders, depending upon which myth you're
Yeah,
reading.
they're trying to push it over there.
Right. It looks like it's on his back.
Yeah.
Right. Interesting. So we're going to get eventually into,
So that means, can we still walk around Crane's Roost or no?
generally, yes, but we're going to get to why in a few more Mishnayot, right? Which is there are ways that that statues, even of gods, can be desanctified and therefore no longer a problem. But that we'll have to handle next week. Hopefully the whole weather will have cleared by next Wednesday and we'll be able to have our regular session. If not, keep your eyes out for announcements, notices, and all of those things.
And not only that, if you go to Crane's Roost, they have a imprinted birds. And
Right, like little sculptures of cranes, right, that go along with the name, right? So we're going to talk more about what's the difference between worshipped and non-worshipped items, and even if it's a god, sometimes it's not a problem. But that sometimes is what we're going to have to debate. All right,